slide, so please don't worry. Every content that comes up on the screen will be shared with you afterwards as well, and will also be shareable with anybody else you need to pass it on to. And if you're tweeting or Instaing this afternoon, then our hashtag is #AYearOfCovid. And I just want to say, before I go into kind of my primary comments, that I wanted to do a big shout out for all of the speakers this afternoon, not only for giving their time this afternoon and kind of taking part in this conversation, but also I know every single one of them has been working their absolute socks, boots, and various other things off over the last 12 months during COVID. And so they are a set of people who I hope you'll find really inspiring to listen to and engage with. I definitely find really inspiring when the going's got a bit tough this year, and really appreciative of all of them being here this afternoon. The final thing I want to say before I go on to kind of the event itself is we always treat any event at SafeLives with the spirit of know them and us. So we know that although many of you joining this afternoon are coming from a practitioner perspective, you may also be coming from a survivor perspective as well. And every single one of our speakers values, honors, and draws on that experience as we go through the course of the afternoon. So I just want to kind of name that in many of the people on this call this afternoon will be survivors as well as specialist expert practitioners. So just calling that out for everybody. So the year that we have just seen through, and obviously we are still living through to some extent when it comes to COVID, feels like maybe a bit of a score draw between us and domestic abuse. And that, you know, you may feel the balance is in a different place, but I guess what we're really clear about is that the pressure on frontline services has been absolutely immense. We don't know yet the absolute extent of the kind of rise in volumes of domestic abuse during this period, but of course we can see, and you'll hear this afternoon about the rise there's been in people trying to get the help they need, or indeed kind of trying to reach out for somebody else that they think might be at risk, or people worried about their own behavior. So all of that has been going on. But what we do know in all of those conversations as well is that the complexity and severity of what frontline practitioners are kind of responding to has definitely increased, and in some cases has become extremely acute and severe beyond what it was before the pandemic started. And that's particularly in relation to mental health, as well as the sheer kind of risk to somebody's safety, physical safety, living in a home where there's no respite and so few chances to be outside and away from the situation, whether you're an adult or you're a child. We also know that those frontline practitioners, all of you as frontline leads and practitioners, have had a devil of a job trying to care for your teams during this whole period. This has been an extreme pressure on people's well-being. Even if you haven't been bereaved, even if you haven't yourself had COVID, there has been so many challenges thrown in people's way. And so we are hugely appreciative of everybody joining this call this afternoon to give up your time to have the conversation, not least when restrictions are just lifting a little bit in some bits of the UK. But we know how much effort you've been putting in over the last 12 months. And I hope this afternoon is a bit of a celebration and validation of all of the work that you've been doing, as well as us talking about some of the things that have been really hard. In terms of the wins that I feel like maybe we've achieved over the last 12 months, I feel like we've got a few more players on the pitch. So really big changes this year that we've seen at SafeLives have been big retail and corporate organizations who've never formed part of the conversation about domestic abuse before have come to us and have come to other organizations and said, what can we be doing, either for our workforce or for our customer base or for both? So Hannah is going to post in the chat a slide which just shows the kind of timeline of how some of these things have happened over the course of the year, and it will be up on the webpage afterwards as well. One of those being the Ask for Annie scheme, which was about really big retailers like Boots and Superdrug now coming on board and saying, we're going to open up our space for people who need just that bit of release, that way out, that way to have a conversation, or even just a few minutes by themselves to deal with what they're going through during COVID and a domestic abuse situation. Having those kind of players take part in the domestic abuse response is new and really, really brilliant. And they are very, very welcome to this work. Ditto organizations like NatWest, who've been involved with the very brilliant charity Surviving Economic Abuse for a while, but are now really to act as a conduit to frontline services to make sure that if you're a survivor and just need that 150 quid or that 200 quid, which is going to make a difference, help you fix the car, help you change a room, help you get into a refuge, whatever the money is needed for, gets that money to the frontline survivor as soon as she needs it for whatever she needs it for. So we are really appreciative of organisations kind of coming forward and playing that part. But we know there have been losses as well. There's been a huge swell of unknown need behind closed doors, both for adults and for children. And it's not clear to us when the end point for that is going to be, because we know not everybody is going to be able to get out from behind those closed doors straight away. And we also know that perpetrators, having quite enjoyed the extra levels of control they've had over the last 12 months, might be very unwilling to relinquish that control as the restrictions start to lift. So we're not out of that yet. And we know that of the survivors who've been in touch with us at SafeLives, as we've done some work on this over the year, 2/3 have said that they haven't been able to reach out, either because they just didn't feel it was safe to do that, or they just couldn't practically find a way to do that. So we know that a lot of people have been really, really trapped, even more so than they normally would be. We also know there's been some persistence in bag commissioning and funding practice. Some of it's been amazing, and we really appreciate those funders and commissioners who've changed their usual ways of working, been more agile, been more flexible. But we know that there have also been some bits of the UK where frontline services have really, really struggled, either with crazy deadlines or crazy criteria, or just really difficult situations in terms of, you know, commissioners wanting to run normal commissioning procedure while people were dealing with a pandemic and a crisis. And we know that there's been a loss of access to really, really important non-specialist domestic abuse services. So I talked about mental health. We know that in some parts of the country, CAMHS has just closed its doors entirely to children and adolescents who needed that mental health support. So there's been a huge challenge in frontline domestic abuse services trying to hold that situation that they're not necessarily equipped and supported to do because those other services weren't available. So I'm going to close just by saying I know that there's been a kind of collective gritting of teeth, you know, so this amazing timeline that Hannah's showing you on the screen does show some fantastic things that have happened, but we know that people have been grinding their teeth to try and get to this point over the last 12 months, and that has been really, really bloody hard, and we know we're not over it yet. So I hope that what we've seen over the last 12 months proves a moment for fundamental change, both in terms of those extra players on the pitch and also some recognition that some of the things that have been problematic for a long time have got to change. And I know we're going to hear about that from a number of our speakers this afternoon. We don't want to go back to the way things were before the pandemic. We don't want to lose that rise in public awareness that we've had and that rise in kind of momentum and motivation that we've had from some organisations to take part in the response to domestic abuse. So let's keep pushing forward, knackered as we all are, but let's celebrate each other's work. I hope you have a really good afternoon listening to our speakers. Thank you all again for joining. You're not going to hear from me for most of the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to pass on to others who will introduce each other, but really appreciative of you being here. The first person I'm going to hand over to is one of our research managers at SafeLives, and her name is Martha, and she's joining you now. Thanks, everyone.
Hi everyone, sorry for that slight delay. I've got the fun thing of trying to share a screen and unmute yourself all at the same time, which always goes well. So thank you for that introduction, Suzanne. My name is Martha Tomlinson and I'm a research manager here at SafeLives, and I'm going to be talking to you about the Practitioner survey that we have done so it's a survey of domestic abuse practitioners in England and Wales. This is the 6th time that we've actually run this survey with the aim to identify how many independent domestic violence advisors, or IDVAs, there are supporting victims and survivors of domestic abuse. This is across England and Wales, and it's carried out on behalf of the Home Office. So with this annual survey, we aim to capture the challenges and experience of domestic abuse providers and the services that they work in. This also allows us to highlight any gaps in provision provision, so that in the support for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. It's vital that we listen to the voice of those working on the front line in order to understand what their experience has been during the pandemic and resulting lockdown measures. So with that in mind, we also ask questions around the impact of COVID and funding. Now, just to give you a brief overview of how we ran the survey, it was sent to nearly 500 organisations. Half of those had responded previously to our practitioner surveys, and the remainder were organisations that might have domestic abuse services, such as housing providers, as well as those that were identified for us by the offices of the Police and Crime Commissioners, or PCCs. So after we removed the duplicates, we'd had responses from around 150 services, employed a range of frontline domestic abuse workers, and the responses were, all of these were included in our qualitative analysis. So those are those kind of questions around COVID and funding. It is worth noting that we had a lower response rate this year than previously. We all know the pressure that's on the front line at the moment, and many just simply didn't have the capacity to respond. So we decided after the survey had closed that actually to send people emails requesting changes in their provision if they'd responded previously but were unable at this time. This means that the IDVA analysis is actually based on a higher number than responded to our survey. We also shared our provisional results with police and crime commissioners so that it reflected local provision as accurately as possible, and we took their lead where these findings differed to our own. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nicola Stokes now, who will discuss some of the findings with you.
Yes, so first of all, we asked practitioners whether they'd seen an increase in demand on their services since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and 88% of practitioners who responded said that yes, they had seen an increase in demand. And we then asked practitioners if they'd applied for the emergency COVID-19 funding that the government had made available for domestic abuse services, and 4 out of 5 services, so about 80%, said that yes, they had. Which suggests that many services needed more resources to manage this increase in demand that they were seeing. We asked domestic abuse practitioners one open-ended question about their work during the pandemic, which was, what has been your biggest issue or concern during this time? The answers to this question were varied and covered a range of concerns, but there were several common themes that emerged. The most common of which was given by almost half of all services, was that their biggest concern was the safety of clients and their children. And these concerns were largely based around the fact that the practitioners knew that many clients have been effectively trapped indoors with their abusers during this time. And so the practitioners were finding it very difficult to be able to safely contact their clients and thereby provide them with the support that they needed. 2/5 of the practitioners who we surveyed were also concerned about their own staff capacity, recruitment and funding. While high caseloads have been a problem for many services even long before the pandemic, obviously the effects of COVID have just exacerbated this. Other common themes to emerge from this question around practitioners' key concerns included the fact that just over a quarter of respondents felt that their biggest concern was the delay and unavailability of other services that their clients might need, which included housing, court, services supporting those with poor mental health or substance misuse, which is exacerbated by the fact that there have been more clients with complex needs that seem to have been coming through during this time. Almost 1/5 of responses voiced concern about the effect of the pandemic on the mental health and well-being of their own staff members in relation to stress and staff burnout, which is obviously closely connected to the increase in demand that they were seeing on their services. And finally, 9% of practitioners were worried about the mental health of their clients, which included the fact that they're more isolated because they haven't been able to connect with their normal support networks and family. So those were the key findings from our open-ended questions, and now I'm going to pass back to Martha, who's going to go through some of the numbers around IDVA provision.
Thanks, Nicola. I meant to say that I am joined by my colleagues here, Nicola and Emma, who are 2 wonderful research analysts who work in our team and did a lot of the work on this survey. So I thought it'd be really good if they got a chance to come and present their findings. There are obviously a lot more findings than we can try and go through. We had a run through earlier where we massively went over our 10 minutes. So all of this in much more detail can be found in the report, which is up on our website as of today. So there has been an increase in the number of cases discussed at MARAC. You know, ultimately with the practitioner survey, one of the things that's been the constant is looking at IDVA provision. The increase in MARAC has actually led to an increase in the number of IDVAs that are required to support these victims and survivors who are at the highest risk of serious harm or murder. So for the year 2020, actually, we estimated that 1,220 full-time equivalent IDVAs or FTE IDVAs were required to support all of these. Now, this is the lowest estimate. It's kind of upwards of 1,220. Overall, with our findings, we found that the number of FTE IDVAs has actually plateaued. It's just under 1,000, and that was consistent with the results in 2019. But actually, for the first time, we've seen that those supporting those clients at the highest risk has decreased. The survey results showed that there were about kind of just over 100 FTE IDVAs working in England and Wales supporting these clients at the highest risk, which is actually only 2/3 of the required provision. When we kind of looked actually at regions, there was one region that had the minimum cover of IDVAs and 2 regions that had less than half. And unfortunately, all 9 English regions and Wales have actually seen a decrease in their coverage compared to the 2019 data. Within that, the number of police force areas that have the minimum required coverage is decreasing, and the number of those who have less than 50% is sadly increasing. Now, if you look at the kind of services who told us about their IDVA provision, we actually found that the majority of services employed 5 or fewer FTE IDVAs, and 1 in 10 of those services had an IDVA who was co-based in a health setting, with only 1 in 20 having an IDVA providing specialist court support. Obviously, you know, the majority of IDVAs will work with clients attending court, but this is this more specialist course-based provision. So we did ask services whether they provided support to victims and survivors from marginalised or hidden groups, and we found that 1 in 5 said that they did. This ranged from kind of dedicated by and for services, or others who perhaps had one worker or a specialist area that supported one of these groups. Now, when we went through the findings, there are a few places in the report where we've picked out the differences seen by services who provide this kind of support versus other. But I think the really interesting one that goes on what Nicola was just talking about, the biggest area, is that services were more likely to be concerned about this mental health of their staff and clients accessing, and clients accessing support such as housing were particularly highlighted. Now, in recent years, we have looked at creating estimates for the number of YIPFAs and outreach workers. Unfortunately, because of the lower impact responses we had this year, we weren't able to do that. So instead, if you look in the report, we've produced an estimate of the number of outreach workers that we feel are needed across England and Wales, and also for YIPFAs, as it's important that all types of communities-based support are properly funded. And if you want to have a look at that in the report, there's details in the appendix on exactly how we did that calculation. The final thing I'm going to talk about is funding and resources. So we already know that funding and resources were stretched before COVID-19 hit. So actually now there's an even greater strain put on those sources, and it's important to understand exactly what the response was and whether what the long-term problems that they would face, services would face were. So we asked services whether they felt they had the necessary supports and staffing, and actually more than half answered that they did not, essentially, with 2/5 saying that they were unable to keep up with demand currently. We also asked about whether longer term funding would give more stability to their organisation, and 95% of services said yes, with those who say no actually generally having longer funding cycles of 5 years or more. For those who answered yes, we asked why, what was it about longer term of funding that would provide stability? And half of those said it would allow them to plan for the future, develop services, continue long-term projects like recovery courses for survivors. A third said that actually staff and recruiting was really difficult at the moment because it was very hard to kind of retain staff and to give and provide training for staff when it was always done on such a short-term basis. A quarter of respondents also just noted the time it takes to apply for funding and how much that takes away from their other work, with a further quarter talking about the fact that they'd just be able to provide better support for clients because they know that they were able to provide a better service. So we'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of the domestic abuse professionals who took their time to share their thoughts and their provision levels with us at what's been an unprecedented time for demand in their services, as well as the personal pressure that they themselves experience. So given that they've told us the increased pressure that they face and the impact that the pandemic has had and will continue to have on them and their staff, I'll pass you over to my colleague Emma Retter to discuss the recommendations that we've made arising from these findings.
Hello, thank you, Martha. So the first slide for recommendation is going to look at the funding recommendations that we've made for the government. So firstly, we're recommending that the Victims Funding Strategy and this year's Comprehensive Spending Review creates a 3-year settlement for domestic abuse services, which support the whole family, so adults, teens and child victims, as well as quality assured interventions for perpetrators. We're recommending an annual ring-fenced fund of 56 million just for IDFA provision, and a further 350 million to fund outreach workers. Piecemeal funding during COVID-19, while absolutely was welcome, it still added pressure to services who are putting all their capacity into helping victims get safe. Future government funding rounds should be integrated into one package of support for all domestic abuse services. Next slide, please, Martha. So our findings point to an increase in mental health issues and the need for victims to be able to quickly access mental health support. We recommend that the government commit to shorter waiting times for victims of trauma. The government's You're Not Alone awareness raising campaign alongside the Ask for Annie code word initiative were 2 really helpful developments made during the pandemic. So we recommend that the Home Office adds 2 new audiences into its communication plans. Friends, family and neighbours who should be called to reach in to those who may be experiencing harm, and to perpetrators of harm themselves, reminding them that there is no excuse for abuse. And we recommend that as part of the post-COVID recovery, specific attention is paid to children impacted by domestic abuse, both those who have experienced it at home and those in their own intimate relationships. The government should ensure that in community and youth workers, as well as those in early year settings such as nurseries, CAMs and school nurses should receive cultural change training to ensure they understand the impact of domestic abuse on children and how to refer them to specialist support. Our recommendations for local commissioners. Firstly, we recommend that domestic abuse strategic partnerships ensure that commissioning cycles are 3 to 5 years. We recommend and believe that where services are co-produced with survivors locally, it will help to future-proof responses to domestic abuse services for the whole family. Alongside this, robust data sets will ensure that commissioners can measure improvement and gaps in local provision. We recommend cultural change training for multi-agency professionals working with families affected by domestic abuse. This will help to lift understanding of domestic abuse and coercive controlling behaviour to ensure everyone around multi-agency tables is starting from a shared place. We've heard from professionals and survivors that the squeeze on frontline resources is stark. This was the case before the COVID-19 pandemic, but those existing pressures have significantly grown due to it. We'd like to finish with this quote from a practitioner. And this was a response to the question, what was the biggest issue or concern at this time? And it demonstrates the many conflicting priorities. So I'll just let you all read that quote. And that's a practitioner survey. As Martha stated, it is on the website now and I'm sure it will be sent round. So for more information, please have a look at it there. And I'd like to introduce SafeLives pioneer and survivor Rachel Williams, who will present on Survivor Voice.
Thank you, Emma. Okay then, so where shall I start? Some of you may know me. My name is Rachel Williams and I'm a pioneer for SafeLives, and I have been for the last 5 to 6 years. And I love being a pioneer and being able to share my raw, authentic voice. I'm a survivor of domestic abuse and an attempted murder. SafeLives have been fabulous and helped me train to become an advocate, where I do a lot of my advocacy work online. I run a Facebook page called Don't Look Back, which is followed mainly by victims and survivors. I use the page to post information about current legislation, cases of domestic abuse which have been reported in the media, campaigns and more. I'm very vocal on my page, as some of you might know, sometimes getting me into trouble, Crown Court being one of them, but that is another story. Each day I'm inundated with direct messages from victims and survivors alike, and I've seen a massive increase in the volume of messages on my page. Some months these messages have been in excess of 600 to 800, and I'm a one-man bandit and it's a lot to get through. When we went into lockdown, my heart really sank as I knew what the victims and survivors would be going through. We know that those who live in these toxic homes are victims, but theoretically they are survivors because they're surviving to the best of their ability day in, day out. We talk about living with a domestic terrorist. It's like walking on eggshells, but during COVID, it must have been like walking on broken glass. One of the main concerns I keep hearing from followers were, are services open? Were frontline services still operating? Were the police going to turn up if I call them? My constant message was yes, they're going to come to your call. And I've done many interviews during lockdown, TV, radio and newspapers. And my message constantly was the police are going to come through that door regardless of whether an abuser opens it, coughs and says he's got COVID. I also very weirdly ended up on Japan TV, which I find really hilarious even now, which was quite bizarre. And I'm still actually waiting for them to make a Rachel doll. So I'll keep you posted if they do. So during the first 15 weeks of lockdown, I hosted weekly webinars, normally on a Monday at 2 p.m, where I invited those in the domestic abuse arena to come on, talk and present to listeners who were made up of victims, survivors and professionals. Professionals who were passionate and concerned about what was coming next and what could be done differently, as we were all about to learn how to work to the best of our ability during a pandemic and still being able to support those most vulnerable in society. These webinars were the highlight of the week for many. Some speakers included MP Jess Phillips, DA Commissioner Nicole Jacobs, Professor Jane Monkton-Smith, Laura Richards, Dr. Emma Katz. We had Kyla from the Drive team and many more. The largest crowd drawn was for Professor Evan Stark, who joined us from Chicago and talked for over 3 hours solid. And we had 285 people listening in. These webinars gave people hope that we were all coming together to help each other, share best practice and learn from each other. And most importantly, it sent the message out to those who had and would experience abuse that we were there for them no matter what. Before lockdown, I was delivering the Freedom Programme in my local church venue to 8 ladies. I took the programme to Zoom, quickly becoming IT savvy, now feeling like the queen of Zoom. My group quickly grew and I went from 8 in my group to my Tuesday evening group having anything from 55 to 73. This was not including my Monday groups where there was 25 to 30 in each group. This was challenging. I keep saying it was like trying to keep a load of puppies in a pen because everybody wanted to talk. But now I've got this down to a fine art and the women are fantastic, all supportive of each other and respectful of each other's voices. Over 500 women have signed up to the Freedom Programme since June last year. Over 186 have completed the full 12-week rolling programme. And of those ladies who are attending, 28 of those were still with their perpetrators and 3 have already left safely. The Mirror covered this in a double spread just a few weeks back, and on the back of that article, I have had more women signing up. Other facilitators were worried about how those living with perpetrators were going to be able to join. Don't ever underestimate the strength and the ability of victims and survivors. They will not put themselves in any danger. I had one lady joining from work while she cut hair as a barber and several sitting in their cars and others doing shopping. Out of the 186 women who have fully completed the programme and fed back into the evaluation form, these were some of the findings. 186 said that their knowledge of the personas of the perpetrator had increased. 174 said they felt that they would know what warning signs to look for in the future. And 184 had a better understanding of domestic abuse and the effects on children. The programme is having a massive impact. It's even gone global. I have a lady in Italy, South Africa, Russia, Belgium, and currently I have 3 ladies in America on the programme. Other issues I've heard a lot of is the length of time that cases are taken to get to court, the police and CPS taking too long to investigate a case, etc., and then it's falling out of the 6-month time frame. Perps pleading guilty in magistrates' court to avoid going to crime court, then getting short custodial sentences if being sent to prison at all. And abusers also withholding maintenance for the children and women being left in awful financial positions. On a plus, I'm pleased that I was a cog in the wheel to get non-fatal strangulation recognised as a standalone charge, and that is now going to be added to the DA bill. My petition gained over 100,000 signatures, which helped the Centre for Women's Justice and others push for this amendment to be added. And I'm so pleased it is, because this will save lives. I think COVID has brought out the best and worst in people. For me, I have seen mostly the best, and we're all cogs in the wheel for change, and united our voices are stronger. What I have learned is that problems don't disappear if they are ignored. Sadly, too many professionals think if they ignore the problem, it'll go away. CAFCAS and Family Court, I believe, have this way of thinking. I cannot come on a Zoom and not share the voice of those I advocate for. Family Court and CAFCAS keep me awake at night. My petition on this has over 200,000 signatures, and 1,000 extra signatures have been added to this in the last month alone. I want the problems to be solved, not just to get older. A major problem is when it's yours, and it's a minor problem when it's somebody else's. Domestic abuse is a major problem that we should all own. We have had leaders not solving the problem, but leaving it for the next person, almost like a hand-me-down. We need to tackle the problem head on, and the only way we will do this is to listen and to work with those with lived experience. I hosted a webinar with Lundy Bancroft last week, the third with him in the last 6 months. And he said the only way we're going to abolish the misogynistic culture, make new laws and change legislation is to start a revolution at grassroots level. The message of success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem we, you, us had last year. I don't want the same problems next year. 2021 is the year of change, and everybody should stand up to domestic abuse. So let's start the revolution. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm due to speak next, and I'll join the revolution with you. So that was fantastic. Thank you. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to our hosts today for inviting me to come and speak and have an opportunity to talk about the work of Carmen Ivana. I'm the Executive Director of Carmen Ivana, and I'm really pleased to be here today because it's an issue that isn't spoken about enough, so any opportunity is really welcomed. For those of you that are not familiar with our work, we deliver a national helpline for victims, survivors and professionals supporting the same of honour-based abuse. The helpline is Home Office backed and part funded, but really is one of the very few specialist services for victims of honour-based abuse. I think it's really important to start by giving some context to the issues of honour-based abuse because it is so massively hidden and underrepresented when we think about domestic abuse and the domestic context in which this takes place, because honour-based abuse is a form of domestic abuse. And this was really illuminated in data last year, which showed that 99% of the contacts to the helpline were personally connected to the perpetrator, making the clear connection that honour-based abuse is a form of domestic abuse. However, with that said, unfortunately, honour-based abuse is often framed as a traditional harmful practice and put into this cultural cul-de-sac, which is really damaging for two key reasons, really. Firstly, it supports the normalisation and legitimacy that perpetrators use against victims, that this is cultural or this is traditional, loaded with expectations for what honourable women should do and how they should behave. And two, it also drives practitioners to sometimes overlook abuse out of genuine fears of not wanting to cause offence or being deemed as culturally insensitive, fears that we absolutely understand and recognise are rooted in poor confidence in understanding the issues more broadly and understanding that this is domestic abuse. We know at Carmen Ivana and SafeLives insight data echoes that victims of honour-based abuse face multiple barriers and find it harder to access support that's unique to their experiences. Victims tend to stay in abusive environments for longer when compared to those that haven't had honour as a dynamic in their experience. And we know that shame, stigma, and harmful community responses frequently prevent victims from seeking help. We also know that victims of honour-based abuse are more likely to have multiple perpetrators, which again is another factor that makes it more difficult for them to access support. And the reason that I highlight all of this is because at the start of the pandemic, we didn't anticipate huge call volumes because we knew that the COVID lockdown environment was going to provide another layer of challenge to getting help. We knew that victims of honour-based abuse would be locked in with multiple perpetrators, and that when we think about honour-based abuse, we know from data that coercive control is one of the biggest things that are used against a victim. So the lockdown environment created the perfect zone for that to happen undetected. So we didn't think we were going to get many calls, but oh, how we were very wrong. If I could go to the next slide, Sarah, if that's okay. So on average for last year, we sat at 75% increase on contacts when compared to the year before. So just to kind of put that into numbers, that's 7,290 to 12,789, which was a huge, huge jump. And although the average was 75%, we saw different trends at different points of the lockdown. So May in particular was a huge period of demand where we had a 249% increase, which was challenging to say the least. If we go on to the next slide, I'll just talk you through some of the trends relating to different issues. Sorry, I've animated this. So the first click is that we saw a 40% drop in the threat of forced marriage. Now that's not totally surprising given that the lockdown has restricted travel, has restricted how people can marry. So that's not entirely unsurprising. And in fact, at the beginning of the lockdown, we had some people suggest that the lockdown had been very helpful. The restrictions had been helpful because marriages that were planned for April, May, June were now put on hold. And note that I say put on hold, coronavirus hasn't stopped them from happening. They will happen at some point, and we've got to really be prepared for this surge that we're expecting at some point that we haven't seen just yet. The next drop that we had was a 30% drop in referrals from school. And I don't think we can not acknowledge the fact that young people have been very absent in contacts to the helpline. For many reasons, the fact that schools have been closed, but often it's our experience for young people who experience honour-based abuse that they're relying upon that person, that trusted person in school, or that agency to recognise the abuse that either they don't recognise or have real genuine fears about speaking out. And they haven't had that. And even though schools have returned now, we don't have the normal environment of school. So you might have that trusted teacher that you can't see because of the bubbles that we have at school. So we're not quite where we need to be to see those increases that we're hoping will come at some point. We have seen an increase in third-party and family referrals, and I think the publicity around the You Are Not Alone campaign and the fact that our helpline number was shared as part of that campaign has been massively helpful. We just hope that that continues, as was the recommendation I heard earlier on. Moving forward, it's been one of the real positives that there's been more exposure to the issues and more reporting as a consequence. And then finally, the last two, we've had a 50% increase in people reporting deteriorated mental health, and a consequence to that is that we've had to provide more emotional support via the helpline. So you will have noticed on the previous slide that we've had more outgoing contact because that support has been needed for a longer period of time. So just moving on to the next slide. So the challenges, might need to click again. Thank you. I don't know why it's done that. Increased demand has obviously been a huge, huge challenge. And we had a real limited transition from working in the office in an environment which is so crucial when you're working on a helpline as part of a team. We didn't have that, and we had very limited time to transition to now working from home, taking calls of the nature that we do in our own personal environments. That was really, really challenging. We've had staff sicknesses linked to COVID, so a relatively smaller team, and also staff members with children that have had to homeschool, which has made it really difficult. And when we've tried to recruit as well, we've had challenges when we've tried to recruit for language call handlers in particular. because we find that there are people that have the language skill but don't have the sector experience, and it's more difficult to train at a distance safely. So that's been really, really difficult, but we've now managed to successfully do that. And then staff welfare as well. This, increased demand, working from home, some call handlers working at home with families, taking calls of the nature that there have been, has been really, really difficult. And as an organisation, we've had to manage that, so have our regular debriefs and our checking in and having really robust communication so that we're on top of welfare all of the time. So in terms of the next steps and the things that we would like to see, what's going to be really, really important is future sustainable funding to reflect the new and continued demand. We don't see that this is going to go down when we're out of this. It will be dealing with the lockdown, the pandemic, and the consequences for a very long time. And we've got to now prepare for what's going to come. We've got to be proactive rather than reactive. As I alluded to earlier, we know that cases of forced marriage that did not happen will happen at some point when things go back to normal. We've reflected on the absence of young people. We know that it may take years before we'll see the actual impact that has had. So we've really got to improve our engagement and our access to specialist services if we really want to ensure that we're being proactive and not just wait until people eventually come forward, which we know for honour-based abuse tends to be a bit longer anyway. And finally, we need to create greater representation and accountability. We've heard about the inequality gaps that have long existed before the pandemic, but that's widening. And it's so important that we understand and acknowledge all the different experiences and challenges facing victims of domestic abuse, including honour-based abuse within that, because that's often missed. Domestic abuse isn't a one-size-fits-all, and the support and representation of the issues shouldn't be either. I think we've all got an opportunity in this space to use any table where we see that there isn't a seat, where issues aren't represented. And that's happened for us over the lockdown, where members of the SafeLives team have actually recognised, Carmen Ivana should be part of this conversation, that issue is not reflected, and we've then had a seat. I don't know whether, I think there's a combined issue, the fact that we're up north and we're frequently cut out of the conversations that take place in a very London-centric way, but also these issues just more generally are not well represented. So, if you have opportunities, please do use those. So thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to take questions, but I'll now hand over to Shona from Aurora New Dawn.
Thank you, Natasha. That was brilliant. I've kind of forgotten what I was meant to be saying because I was listening to you so hard. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what Aurora's response to the pandemic was. I haven't got any PowerPoint and I haven't written a speech, so I'm going to have to time myself because I have a tendency to go off on a tangent, but we'll see how we get on. Okay, so the first response was panic. Let's not lie about that. We can all be very sort of, used to being professional and making sure that we're calm in crisis. I'm not going to lie, we crapped ourselves. So it was a lot of panic, fear, panic, repeat. And just a real sort of feeling of how are we going to get to victims and survivors? How do we do this? How do we reach out? How do the access points that we are used to, that we've all become accustomed to, a lot of those had started being shut off. So that's why we were panicking, really. And then, within about 5 minutes, I'll not forget it because we were in the management office and we just went into crisis response. And what helps in frontline working is that the senior management team are all frontline workers. We all come with a background of having worked as either IDVAs or in refuges or ISVAs, or so once a crisis worker, always a crisis worker. Once a frontline advocate, it just is like riding a bike. So in terms of myself, what did I do? Well, I feel when I feel like that, I have to do something tangible. So I wrote a safety plan, and probably looking back at it now, it's probably rubbish. But actually, I think what helped was it started the conversation. It started, conversation with SafeLives. It started conversation with colleagues locally, of just everybody started to gear up because we were all feeling the same. And the other thing I did was I wrote a blog post, which actually was just me. It's just a cathartic way of me getting my kind of thoughts out, and that actually was received well as well, because it's that age-old thing of, oh God, thank God we're all feeling like this. We're all really, really concerned about how we do this. So within a day, all staff were working from home. So there was no halt in service provision for Aurora at all. And there was a lesson there, and a confirmation that it pays to have good IT. Now, I bleed through my eyes on the bills that I get for our IT. It hurts when I look at it, but actually, thank God we did have that, because, you get what you pay for. And we had no halt in our service provision to victims, and that's the most important part. So, it was a lesson learned there, because I constantly look at those bills and think, surely we could do this for cheaper. But yeah, so that was a good thing. Within a week, so we usually have a DVA car project, which means that we go out on Friday and Saturday nights, and in the days as well, with police, and we answer domestics. So we are the independent specialist support service that provide that in Hampshire. And our job is basically to engage victims and survivors, to do risk assessments, and to make sure that they're getting the support that they need. We couldn't do that, so because of COVID. So we turned that provision into a 24/7 helpline for Hampshire, and that was operational within a week of lockdown. And we didn't have the funding to do that either. So risks all over the place, really. One of the things that I will say is that I know you all think you've got the best teams, but I do, because not one person in my team, not one woman ever said no. And I know you're all nodding your heads, because actually that is the sector. That's the male violence against women sector for me. That is where we come from. That's our grassroots of, yes, how do I do it? Let me know where I've got to be. How do I hook up to the helpline? How do I do this? And I include, management is in that as well, because I asked both my senior managers to come on a rota with me, and we're still on every third week. We're on 24/7 for 7 days, and we support the team to make sure that the helpline runs. We also did some safe at home surgeries with partner agencies as well. So another really positive thing was that all local organisations started to talk to each other more, and we started to share more things and make sure that we were all part of different campaigns, and retweeting each other, and just supporting each other in that way. And we actually still have a COVID meeting that was organised by the police that we all jump on every week, which has been a real benefit. So in terms of the helpline, we saw a 63% increase in referrals, and that hasn't dropped. To date, we have taken just under 2,500 calls on that helpline, and we in the first week of lockdown lifting, we saw another 48% increase on that too. So the message that I always have is, look, just because lockdown's lifted, it doesn't mean this is going away. In fact, it's just about to get an awful lot worse in terms of resources. 44% of victims called out of hours. So that was a really good lesson for us. And actually, we've adapted our service design so that our next bid incorporates the helpline into the DVA cars, because what we do at Aurora is victims and survivors are our central priority, and we respond to what they need. So 44% of victims called either like 4 o'clock in the morning or at the weekends, and there's no service provision in Hampshire for that. So we work with our partner, the Commission Service, and they supported that idea as well. So 54% of victims want information and advice only. They don't necessarily want an onward referral. And I think that's a lesson as well, sometimes in getting stuck into the way that commissioning is done and the commissioning landscape, and freeing ourselves up a little bit as organisations to understand that our flexibility creates innovation and responds to victims' needs, and it doesn't need to be complicated. Give them an access point and they will find it if they possibly can. You know, it's like a river, and it had all these different dams on it, and we've lifted all of them and found the access points for them. So there's a real lesson for us. In terms of frustrations that I had as a CEO, I do have frustrations in funding, because there were so many applications at once that it was really hard to keep up. At points, I know I missed stuff because I was also doing frontline work myself, you know, so you know, we're a small organisation and it's really hard to keep up. There are positives about funding. There are so many, and it was so fast. It was really nice to see funders being able to turn around applications in 3 days. I'd like to see that kept up, please. Obviously that's not going to happen, but you know, you can always ask. We obviously met our target on the deficit that we would have had with the helpline. We met that, and that's largely down to the big lottery, and also some really amazing organisations like the Treebeard Trust, and some amazing fundraisers from community services. I know I'm going to have missed people that funded us, so I apologise now. In terms of the team, yes, I'm worried about them. Yes, we've all taken a hit on our mental health. I'm not going to lie about that. I know that the next 2 speakers are going to talk about that in much more detail. But as a CEO, I am desperately worried about my team, because we are all people that just tend to look after each other. So we don't tend to say, actually, no, I'm struggling. So we did do a lot of things where we tried lots of different ways that we could start talking about things. And actually, I think the best thing that worked for us was just doing really, really stupid quizzes. One of which, one member of the team turned up in gold lame hot pants because she decided to come as Kylie. So that made us laugh. But yeah, our budget on counselling and clinical supervision has gone up, and I expect it will go up again this year. We won't ever go back to ever accepting that domestic violence and abuse is not on the national stage. It's here now. So, you know, we are a loud sector, notoriously loud. So let's stay loud about it and not give anybody an excuse to ignore the platform again, and continue working really hard. Thank you very much for having me. I am handing over, I'm having to read this, otherwise I'm going to get it wrong, to Janine and Sue.
Thank you, Shona. And I'm joined by Sue Penner, who's going to speak next. We're sharing this session, and I just want to say that was really emotional, actually, Shona, what you've just described there for your team, and the same with you, Natasha, as well. And it kind of really, I don't need to say why we felt the need to set up the support and wellbeing groups, because you've actually just described that for us very eloquently. And it was that feeling when I first sat in the chief executive's call that SafeLives was hosting, and hearing those stories from you and other chief executives that were on that call of just how struggling the frontline were, the professionals were. And these are, you know, professionals that were continuing to work, continuing to see high risk, often sat on the end of their bed in their bedroom. So all of that vile stuff that they normally have to deal with going into their personal space. It didn't feel right that actually there was no support around that for professionals. So that was the real driver behind SafeLives, and I've called it, but you know, putting our shoulder to the wheel. It felt like there was something really practical that we needed to do, that we couldn't be sat in our ivory tower doing, you know, policy and projects and stuff, but actually we also needed to get down and put our shoulder to the wheel in this. And it felt like providing support and well-being for the front line, enabling them to keep going and keep supporting, was the right thing. And I think when the second wave came, and working in health, I felt this too, where the first wave, everybody kind of got through on adrenaline and felt that they were, you know, it was going to end. But when that second wave hit before Christmas, it was like, oh, here we go again. And I think that was when, you know, people really started to feel it. So in terms of what we did, and I'll talk a little bit about what we did and how we set it up in a few minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Sue, who came in to really develop what the support and wellbeing groups looked like and what the content was. And the first thing we did was look at how we could secure any funding, and we did secure a small pot of funding from the Home Office to support the setup of the groups. But we also utilised our own internal resource. So we paused some work and refocused some of our practice consultants' time onto being able to set these groups up. And we felt that that was really important. Firstly, the staff themselves felt that they wanted to be a part of this, but also we felt that it was more important that we reorganised our resource in that way to be able to turn this around really quickly. So from the time of this concept being realised to us actually operationalising was only about 3 to 4 weeks. So everybody pulled the stops out to do that, including Sue and Rockpool. So we brought that expertise in through Rockpool, as well as utilising our own expertise. And we also wanted to make sure we had governance around this, because we realised that we could be there could be safeguarding issues that came up, really, so people who were really struggling. So whilst some only needed that support and wellbeing type group environment, others might need more than that. So we set up some safety nets and some safeguarding around that. And Sue actually ran a debrief session every Friday for the facilitators of the groups to make sure that they were safe as well in delivering the groups. We had to set up a whole new booking system because we've never done this before. And Sarah, who's sat in the background today, did an amazing job of staying on top of that and making sure that it worked seamlessly. And there were lots of issues and snags, which normally when you're setting a project up like this, you've got about 3 to 4 months to sort out. We sorted it out in about 3 weeks. And as I said, that's thanks to all the team and how they pulled together. But it was important that we did it in a very timely way. Next slide, please. So what the model looks like and what we are offering is a tiered approach, really, and Sue will tell you a bit more about the resilience self-help tool, which is under development and almost there from Rockpool. The support and wellbeing groups is what I'm going to tell you a little bit about and Sue's going to talk about the content of that. And then we also had provision for one-to-one clinical supervision, so additional clinical supervision for those that needed that additionality. And we think that this is a model that should be taken forward. And again, like some of the other issues that Natasha and Shona have raised, these are things that have come out of the pandemic, which we think should be sustained and should be normal practice going forward. And this is a framework that we think can work for support and wellbeing of frontline practitioners. Next slide, please. So who took up the offer? We actually facilitated 57 support and wellbeing groups between January and March. 325 people attended those groups from around 121 different organisations, and you can see the split there of the organisations. Predominantly these were specialist domestic abuse services, including buy and force services, and we did put on some specific groups for some organisations like Carmen Nirvana and some other more specialist services. But we also seen a range of professionals who were dealing with domestic abuse frontline. And next slide, where I think I'm going to hand over to Sue to talk about the virtual staff.
Thank you, and I just very quickly say how delighted I was to be able to work with SafeLives on this project, because it felt like just the very timely and important piece of work, because certainly from our perspective we've been hearing the same things that you were hearing about people just being on their knees really delivering services. So what we offered, what I was asked to look at, to provide, was a safe space for people to be able to reflect, to look at how what was happening was affecting them,
and a space to look at some strategies. I think what struck me all the way through COVID, and I've been on more Zooms than I care to list, is the number of times that I have been in people's bedrooms, and in people's kitchens, and in people's front rooms, in people's children's bedrooms, and talking to frontline practitioners who are on a daily basis, from domestic abuse workers and family workers and children's social workers, who are listening to some of the most difficult issues in their personal space. And for me, this boundary, this lack of boundaries for people, I think is the thing that hurts people, because there is no separating from the person you are at work and the person that you are. What was important was to reinforce to people what they weren't getting. So this isn't supervision, this isn't case management or therapy. This is a place to provide some psychoeducational input around maybe helping people understand what's happening for them emotionally, and to provide some very simple techniques to help people work things out for themselves. And really crucially, wanting to move away from my biggest fear, which is we're going to end up with a lot of people medicalized through this pandemic when they don't need to be. So I think there's something about, we are living through exceptional times, and that means that we feel and behave maybe in exceptional ways, but it doesn't mean we're poorly. Can I have the next slide, please? I think this was just, thinking again a little bit more. I haven't got a lot of time, so I'll go over this one quite quickly. What we're seeing really is that all of us are experiencing this thing called cultural trauma, and cultural trauma is something that happens when the very fabric of what we believe in is altered because of something, which is what the pandemic is. So I guess what we looked at was the concept that all of us have experienced some sort of trauma, and for some of us that trauma will be harder to manage because it will unsurface previous traumas. And that's going to happen for the clients we're working with, but it's going to happen for us. A lot of us come into this sector to work because we want to make better for people things that happen to ourselves. So there's that risk of people being their own personal stuff being re-traumatized. Can I have the next slide, please? We focused in the work by looking at developing resilience. And I mean, resilience is a funny old word. It can be used as a deficit model thing sometimes, is you're just not resilient enough, which is suggesting that that people are lacking in something. We don't use it in that way. We use resilience in the term that resilience is our bounce back that most of us have, but during this pandemic, a lot of us have felt that we've lost. And without that bounce back, it's quite hard to keep having to deal with what we're having to deal with on a daily basis. And even if we're managing at work, it might mean that we're not managing very well at home. So there's a hidden here is that people tipping up for work every day seeming to be okay, but we don't know what the cost is for home life. Can I have the next slide, please? This list is literally the list of things that help to develop resilience. So what we do in the work with people is look at how can you do these things, and like anything that is around improving our mental health, it can feel a bit of a slog. The easy thing to go for is the quick fix. We used to talk about this when I'm doing vicarious trauma training. It's much easier to go for your bag of crisps or your glass of wine or your bit of chocolate, because that just instantly, that sugar hit or that alcohol hit makes you feel a bit better, and you instantly get a short-lived and not to be kept at response, so you feel a bit better. These things, which are much harder to do because they involve a little bit of planning and a little bit of thinking about, actually provide you with a much more sustainable, positive and resilient well-being. I'm not going to go through this. You're going to get these slides anyway, and you can have a look at them, and coming up you'll be able to find out more a bit about them. I'm just realizing on time. Can I have the next slide, please? It speaks for itself. Resilience bingo. It is an activity you can do yourselves or do with your staff. Every one of these activities on this resilience bingo will develop your resilience. They are taken from that list above. They fit in with that list above. And all of these things are things that you can do and practice. Okay, next list, please. So this was some of the results from people that came onto the programme. And I think if you look at that hand there, 94% of people felt that the session would have a positive impact on their morale. That's phenomenal. But also, I think in that top right-hand box, feeling that they're not alone was also really important. And that's the little bit I mentioned earlier on about not pathologizing people, not leaving people feeling that there's something wrong with them. To actually have that shared experience, if we're all feeling this at this time, is very healing. Okay, next slide, please. So Janine wanted me to just talk very quickly about what we're going to do moving forward. So at the moment, in partnership with SafeLives, we're developing this resilient self-help toolkit, which I'm hoping will be available quite soon. What that's going to be is opportunity to access a tutorial, a webinar that you can watch in your own time around those issues that I've talked about, and some of the stuff that we found was really helpful for the groups that we worked with. There will be access to an ebook, and that ebook will take you through different stages of a trauma model. So looking at the things that we know that keep us safe and well. So you'll have access to that, and also hopefully lots of other tips of things to read and vids to watch. So that should be coming up fairly soon. Next slide, please. I think I've gone through it, and therefore I am delighted to hand over. I've seen more of Nicole on Zoom this year than I think I've seen in the previous 3 years. Delighted to hand over to Nicole Jacobs.
Thank you. I had to laugh because I do feel like, I'm sure we all feel this. I feel like I've spent my life on kind of back-to-back Zoom meetings, but this is certainly a really important one, and I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's spoken so far. Martha, you've done a great job, and your team obviously on the survey this year, and while you were speaking I was texting my own team at the DA Commissioner's office saying we should have Martha come and do a full briefing on this survey and how it compares to previous years. I had so many questions, and it was very thought-provoking. So a big thank you to SafeLives, and obviously Rachel, Natasha, Shona, Sue. It's been, we've had many times together this year, and it's really important and most important to hear from you in terms of what you've understood this year and experienced and shared, much more so than me. I mean, one of the things, having worked many years in your shoes and in different ways, one of the sensitivities I've had throughout the whole of the year is understanding that how the enormity of the pressures people would be feeling in frontline services, and knowing how much pressure I would have felt myself for many, many years on an average day. And what that felt like. From my perspective this year, many people have said to me, as the DA Commissioner, haven't you felt a lot of pressure this year? And usually my answer is, I can tell you it's nothing close to the pressure that anyone in frontline services will have been feeling this year. So that's the services you've heard from, but any number of frontline services, and obviously in health settings, all sorts of settings. And so anytime I've felt sorry for myself this year, which is actually not that often, but I've definitely had that in mind. And I do want to say just how thankful and grateful I am to all of you, and for people listening who are logged on, who will have done huge amounts of work and untold and all the unsung heroines and heroes of what's happened this year. And so I do want to just convey that, just that kind of basic gratitude. I have a few reflections listening to you. I'm really fascinated by the year in COVID slide. I actually took a picture of it and was looking at it really closely because it mirrors a good bit of my year and some of the meetings I've been in. And one of the most nerve-wracking points of the year was speaking at that Hidden Harm Summit and being introduced by the Prime Minister, which, by the way, was the only time this year I've had that kind of close interaction, although I've talked to a lot of government ministers. And one of the comments I made, and it was to be purposefully a little bit provocative, was to say that COVID had changed nothing, and it had also changed everything. And by nothing, I meant that domestic abuse and wider issues of violence against women and girls have always been so huge. And have always been so prevalent. And so to some degree, although this year has been particularly hard, it hasn't changed in that respect. The fact that it crosses all boundaries hasn't changed. The fact that the calls on our sector and on our frontline workers have always been to go above and beyond, and to not have nearly the kind of support and resource, and to always be so stretched, and to do a lot with very little, that has not changed. And so these were the kinds of things that I wanted to get across in that forum to government. But it's very, very true. And it's a thread of what people have said throughout these presentations. And we have had inadequate response for years and years and years. And that's not a party political thing. That is subsequent governments who haven't stepped up to the plate and done what is needed in terms of having the resource and support that is needed. But what's changed also in terms of changing everything, I do think Suzanne's comments at the start about the players on the field are different. So the attention within government, I've noticed even in the year that I've been appointed, how much that has changed and broadened and kind of deepened in terms of our understanding, societal understanding, the idea that people have been much more sensitive to what it would be like to be in a lockdown with someone you were afraid of or fearful of. Because we've kind of had this shared experience, we can start to identify in maybe in ways that we haven't been able to before, what that would be like. My own concerns for my neighbor, my friends, my family members who I can't see, that worry and that concern. And of course, the media has then responded in the same way. So, a lot more media coverage. One of the things that, I would hope that has played a part in some of that shared understanding is just bringing parties together, bringing services together, government departments. I chair a call that was happening every week and now is every couple of weeks. It happened actually this morning, where we talk and share together. Natasha and others were on it, and we share kind of what's really happening in real time within services, and to communicate that as quickly as possible to government and other really key stakeholders. And a readout from that call goes probably to some of the people who are listening here, I hope. And I think that that's gone some way to make some of those changes and some of these conversations a lot more real and timely and effective, I would hope. A couple of the things that I would just also put in the mix, if I were looking at the year of COVID, that I think have been really important, are the kind of working together at the local level and the innovation that I think we haven't even fully heard of. We are hearing it in kind of anecdotally, and we're hearing it in some ways, but I think we're going to continue to learn there. And I also think in terms of just communication, thinking about the call that I host, but also many, many other opportunities where we're getting together more. I think it used to be that government heard from only a few organizations who were big enough, who would have enough capacity to be communicating with government. And I would like to think and hope that through my office that's broadening, and also through COVID, the fact that we're meeting virtually so much is really changing and opening up those conversations. And that means we're hearing differing perspectives that are really important. And overlaid that with that this year, of course, we've had really serious conversations about race and inequality, Black Lives Matter, and all of that. And that's opened up a lot of conversations that were overdue and long overdue. And so I think, this year has been an unusual year, but as so many people have said, it's also opened up so many opportunities, and it's allowed us to kind of think together, work together in ways that we haven't before. And I think there's some real opportunity in doing that. And of course, we've had the bill, and we've had the VOG strategy, the violence against women and girls strategy, and domestic abuse strategy, and controversies about the separating of the two. But with the bill, I guess one of the things I'm trying to kind of tie it back to SafeLives recommendations, which, by the way, I absolutely agree wholeheartedly with, and I'm really pleased to see them set out in this way. So again, as always, SafeLives is spot on. But one of the things that are, you know, just to kind of comment on where those are headed, you know, one of the really key commitments that the government has made recently in relation to the domestic abuse bill, which will be back in Parliament this Thursday, is about community-based services. So in the detail of some of these recommendations that were spoken about earlier, one real key opportunity for us now is that the government has committed to, and they didn't commit to amending the bill to include community-based services, to extend that part of the bill that is for accommodation-based services to all community-based services. But I think very importantly, we need to remind ourselves that government has committed to consulting on that provision of community-based services, and to do so with the vehicle potentially of the victims bill in front of us, which is one of the future kind of opportunities that we have. So that does require us again to use all of this, these ways that we've come together, tried to understand each other more, talk a lot more, to really shape, well, what do we mean by community-based services? How would we all draw a boundary on what that means? What is our expectation of government to fund those services in a sustainable way? What role do trusts and foundations play in this space, which I've had some really good sessions over the last year as a new commissioner in relation to that. So we have some really great opportunities in front of us in relation to getting to resolve potentially some of the recommendations that SafeLives has put in this report. And, you know, while I could tell you, and I could definitely give you a long list of hard lessons I've learned this year about the frustration of government and the silos that we work in and all sorts of things that need to change. But I also would equally say we've got some tremendous opportunities in front of us. And we have things that we've never had before. We've had honest conversations this year that we haven't had before. We have a way of working and communicating in this way that we haven't done before. We have excellent organizations that you've heard from today, and great leadership. And so I think we can, you know, harness all of that and really make the most of that opportunity. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say, and I think probably all 200 or 300 of you will have done this, but of course, this is the time to make sure we get in touch with our MPs, because this is our very last opportunity now, because we have 9 amendments going back to the House of Commons, 3 of which have to do with migrant women, which are tremendously important. There are amendments in relation to judicial training, for example, that are very important, how we can hold perpetrators to account. There's some really important amendments that we should all be paying very close attention to and getting MPs to look at. So we have some opportunities there, opportunities in the bill implementation, and opportunities in our strategy, our cross-government strategy that will be coming out, that I think we can harness a lot of the ways we've worked together to really make sure that these strategies are alive and feel real to us, and that we have high expectations will be implemented, and that we have high expectations that ministers know and feel fully committed to what's in those strategies. And so I feel that's very positive. I'll draw to a close, but I would like to just let people know kind of what my team is looking like. So we have policy leads within my team now. That's a team that's built up over the year. When the bill passes later this month, I'll drop that designate title and carry on. Joe Silver often jokes with me about how, because I've got a name of commissioner, everyone thinks I commission services. So, but I certainly don't. I sometimes wish I could. But it is very much a policy-driven team, which will be working, again, going back to the recommendations in this report, across all areas of government, including health, which is a very key concern and priority of mine, housing, all of the areas of what I would typically call the coordinated community response to domestic abuse and violence against women and girls. We have a policy team and a research team, which will be looking at doing a lot of that mapping. We have a job advert out for a social researcher right now for anyone who knows any very talented social researchers. And we have a practice and partnerships team, 4 of which are sitting regionally or geographically, because one of the things that I really understand, having worked at the local level for most of my career, is how important the partnerships, the strategic and operational partnerships are at the local level, and being able to communicate with you, understand what the good practice is, understand what the struggles are, and try to respond from the perspective that anything I can do from the perspective of the DA commissioner. So I do want to just let you know that team is there. And if you haven't heard from us locally and you feel you should be on our mailing list for those practice and partnership leads, please get in touch. I'll make sure to put on the chat how you can do that. But I'm just very, very pleased to be part of the conversation. And again, very thankful to all of you and what you've done, and to SafeLives for such a great event. An incredible report, which reflects one hell of a year, that is for sure. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll hand back to Jo.
Thank you, Nicole. And my job was to facilitate a panel, and it's very hard to rugby tackle virtually speakers so that we ended up with enough time to do that. So I'm now balancing to squeeze a question in, and when most of you are leaving, and then that presenter not get the audience that it needs. So what I think I'll do is take an exec decision that we will take all of the questions, we will give them to the right people to answer, and we will post that back to you. We'll put it on our website, and we will put it with the materials of the slide deck so that you have your question answered, and we don't ask a panelist to talk 100 miles an hour and end in some all over chaotic way. So I'm just going to say thank you to everybody, all of our speakers today. But I just want to say from my perspective, a bit like Shona, I felt panicked. SafeLives felt panicked. But as a kind of practitioner and a police officer by trade, panic has to turn into action, even if it's the wrong action, which sometimes it is in the moment. And I feel like SafeLives turned very quickly to meet the panic. But I was thinking, do you know, if I'm going to be in a panic situation, please let me be with Shona, because that would work for me. But what I wanted to say is it felt like an impossible challenge. I feel like the sector and our partners made that possible, and you all made that happen in the most ridiculous circumstances. And I know we're not supposed to sit on beds, and that's not health and safety, and it's not good for our boundaries, but you know, we are in this work for a reason, and that kept us going. I just think we need to think about the next 12 months and not go to la la land where we feel like everything's going back to normal. We do need to recognise perhaps the worst is yet to come for us as professionals, because we've been doing the doing, and when that all starts perhaps to settle down, that will be when we need to take stock. So listening to Sue Penner as always, and trying not to reach for red wine in those moments, I would all ask you really to think about, what have you done this year that makes you feel proud? What part of this response have you played? And go and do something to celebrate that, from resilience bingo or a bag of crisps and a glass of red wine, whatever works for you. I just want to say SafeLives is privileged to be part of the sector that has just thrown itself at this problem, and I for one am proud to be a little cog in that engine. I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you panelists, thank you listeners, and go and do some yoga or drink red wine, up to you. Bye bye.